Dawn crept into a ruined town wrapped in snow and smoke, and the cold hammered everything into silence. At 0530 hours on 21 December 1944, a middle-aged artilleryman named Anthony McAuliffe stood inside a basement command post beneath Bastogne, Belgium, and watched shapes on the horizon harden into tanks. He had not come to command an army. He had come to hold a crossroads. The job had fallen to him because the division commander was far away, the senior deputy was across the channel, and the clock of war had advanced without waiting for perfect assignments. Outside, the frost bit through wool and skin. Inside, maps shook under gloved hands as distant explosions walked toward town along 7 thin roads. The enemy had momentum, numbers, and the advantage of surprise. 3 German divisions were closing the ring. 2nd Panzer from the north. Panzerlehr from the east and south. 26th Volksgrenadier following to consolidate and push. Their wider mission was larger than any single town. They sought the Meuse River and the ports beyond, and only speed could save their plan. Every kilometer mattered, every hour mattered, and every road through the Ardennes pointed like spokes toward Bastogne. The crossroads was more than streets and stone. It was the pivot of an offensive that lived or died by gasoline and distance. The American garrison was a stitched quilt of units rather than a pristine parade. The 101st Airborne Division anchored the line. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division brought a mobile corps of tanks and tank destroyers. Around them gathered artillery battalions, engineers, service troops pressed into rifle duty, and the flotsam of broken formations searching for a place to stand. In sum, about 18,000 men faced perhaps 5 times their number. Most lacked winter clothing. Ammunition was limited. Medical stores were thin. The nearest substantial reinforcements fought 60 kilometers away and would have to cut through an enemy already in motion. The lesson of the previous days was brutal and plain. On the 17th of December, the 106th Infantry Division vanished as a coherent force on the Schnee Eifel, swallowed after a bombardment from more than 1,600 guns and a rapid armored thrust. At Clairvaux, the 28th Infantry Division fought house to house for 2 days and lost the town, leaving the road to Bastogne gaping like an open gate. Spread along long lines, strong points had been crushed in detail. The disaster was not lack of courage. The disaster was geometry. Too many kilometers, too few rifles, and an enemy willing to put steel where it counted. McAuliffe studied the roads with a gunner's eye for angles and timing. Bastogne sat at the center of 7 radials. The Ardennes was not friendly country for tanks once they left the ribbons of macadam. Snow, forest, and broken ground punished any vehicle that strayed. Armored spearheads needed the roads for fuel, ammunition, and recovery vehicles. If those roads were cut or choked, speed failed. If speed failed, the offensive failed. The thought came like a spark snapping across contacts. Encirclement here was not the end of movement. Encirclement here could seize movement from the enemy. He gathered his regimental leaders in a cellar lit by one bare bulb and a thin slice of winter light that leaked through a stairwell. Around the table lay a map dotted with towns and elevation lines, and a ring sketched in pencil that was not quite a circle. The plan was simple, and it was ruthless. Do not waste men trying to hold every meter. Hold the places where the roads and fields conspired to make lanes of approach. Pre-register every likely avenue for artillery. Place anti-tank guns where fields of fire overlapped the roads. Keep a small armored reserve where tracks could carry it quickly to a breach. Accept that ground near the wire might be lost, then taken back, so long as the ring did not break and the guns kept their rhythm. On the 20th of December, the ring closed. German patrols cut the highways with methodical efficiency. The perimeter stretched roughly 26 kilometers, its edges anchored on villages whose names were about to join a long ledger of hard places. Luzery and Marvy on the east. Foy and Noville on the north. The lanes toward Longvilly and Wardin on the southeast. The 101st Airborne Division shouldered most of the line. The 327th Glider Infantry held the longest and thinnest arc, bending from the northwest around to the south. Behind them, 3 battalions of 155mm howitzers crouched in the timber, their plots already scratched onto firing charts. Ammunition was counted shell by shell, but the mathematics of surprise would make each one sting. The first German probe stepped out of the woods that afternoon and came straight down a road, infantry in files within range of machine guns that had been cold for hours. The defenders waited until the range was impossibly close and then cut the column apart in minutes. Losses on the American side were almost nothing. Losses on the German side were bodies on snow and a line of retreat back down the same road that had seemed safe moments earlier. The second probe was stronger and came with tanks, but the Hellcats of the Tank Destroyer Battalion had been sighted to catch them in profile. 3 tanks died in a span shorter than a man needs to lace his boots, and the rest recoiled out of sight. The pattern became visible through the noise. The men in the line were not fighting for a neat frontier but for lanes and nodes, for choke points and interlocking arcs of fire. The enemy was not advancing on a blank canvas but down corridors the defenders had already measured in ranges and timings. When the enemy chose to surround the town, he chose to concentrate. When he concentrated, he became readable. When he was readable, artillery became a language the defenders spoke with brutal fluency. Yet success bred a new fear. The shells that arrived on target in minutes were counted in dwindling stacks. The men who held the line were hungry, sleepless, and cold, their shoulders bowed under greatcoats scavenged from trucks and rail cars and the dead. Surgeons worked with what they had, which was almost nothing. The encirclement had become a trap for both sides, but only one side could live long inside it without supply. The winter sky hung low and blind, and without clear weather there would be no aircraft, no parachutes, no fuel, no bandages, no extra belts for machine guns. The ring could hold against steel. It could not hold forever against arithmetic. West of the town, beyond the horizon and the trees, armored columns felt the same winter press on their hoods and hatches while they fought to reach Bastogne from the south. Between them and the town lay roadblocks, blown bridges, and the armored teeth of a corps that refused to move faster than its fuel would allow. Across the ring, German commanders weighed their own arithmetic and found Bastogne impossible to ignore. A road net cannot be bypassed when it is the road net. To reach the Meuse, the arteries behind the spearheads had to flow. To make them flow, the town had to die. The decision was made to tighten the noose and pull more units into the fight. Inside the cellar, the map did not change, but the pencil marks deepened. The town at the center was no longer a place to be taken. It was now a magnet drawing metal and men and precious hours. The trap had sprung in reverse, and both sides could feel it. The defenders waited for a sky that would not open. The attackers waited for a breach that would not appear. Another night slid over the trees. Fires burned low to hide their glow. Artillery crews leaned on trails and watched the second hand of a wristwatch creep toward another hour's ration of shells. On the ceiling, frost crystals formed and glittered in candlelight, as if the cold itself were taking notes. Then word came of a message carried under a white flag, and the ring grew sharper, and the stakes grew higher, and the next move would demand an answer written not in speech but in steel and time. By the 22nd of December, the town had become a fortress of smoke and snow. The wind carried the hiss of shells and the brittle snap of rifles, but between battles there were long stretches of silence that pressed against the nerves like a weight. Inside the command post, McAuliffe studied the reports laid out before him. Ammunition was dwindling faster than predicted. The food supply had collapsed to crumbs and cans. Men wrapped themselves in blankets scavenged from wrecked vehicles, their breath freezing on fabric. Surgeons in cold basements worked without morphine, using saws dulled by too many wounds. The smell of ether mixed with the sour reek of damp clothes and blood. At 1100 hours, a strange stillness fell along one sector of the perimeter. Out of the mist walked 4 German officers, their white flags stiff with frost. They came to deliver a message. The courier passed it through the American outpost, and soon it reached McAuliffe's hands. The letter was polite, formal, written with the kind of courtesy that hides a blade. It informed the American commander that his forces were surrounded, hopelessly outnumbered, cut off from resupply, and doomed to annihilation unless he accepted the honorable surrender of his troops within 2 hours. McAuliffe read the message slowly. The men around him waited for his decision. Outside, the air seemed to tighten. Then he smiled faintly, as if the absurdity of the moment had broken through the exhaustion. His written reply was brief, a single word that carried more defiance than a paragraph could contain. The note returned through the lines and crossed back into the German camp. The officers who received it did not understand. They had to be told what it meant. The translation stung like a slap. The refusal did more than wound pride. It forced the enemy's hand. To take Bastogne now meant diverting entire divisions from the drive toward the Meuse. Tanks and infantry that should have been racing west were recalled to crush one stubborn town. By the next morning, 3 full divisions encircled Bastogne, their commanders determined to erase it from the map. What they did not realize was that every soldier and every gun they turned inward only tightened the trap around themselves. At dawn on the 23rd, the miracle arrived from the sky. For a week the weather had held its breath, low clouds and snow grounding the Allied aircraft that waited just across the lines. Now the horizon cleared into pale blue, and a sound like distant thunder rolled across the town. Dozens of C-47s droned overhead, their shadows sliding across the snow. Parachutes opened like flowers in the frozen air, drifting down with supplies, ammunition, plasma, food, medical kits, fuel. Each color of silk meant a different salvation. Some bundles drifted beyond the perimeter into German hands, but enough fell true to change everything. The soldiers in the foxholes looked up, faces cracked with cold, and saw proof that they were not forgotten. The artillerymen stacked crates of shells beside their guns. The wounded drank plasma and slept. For the first time in days, men laughed, not because anything was funny but because hope had weight again. The relief was not the end of the siege. It was only a breath before the storm that was coming. That afternoon, the air filled with the roar of fighter bombers. P-47 Thunderbolts swept low over the Trieline, hunting tanks that glinted dark against the snow. The ground shook as bombs fell, and lines of German vehicles twisted into wreckage. The armored columns that had gathered to crush Bastogne were caught in the open, their camouflage useless, their movement visible from miles away. Smoke columns rose until the sky was veiled again. The town below trembled under each strike, but the defenders knew the sound meant survival. For the first time, daylight belonged to them. As evening settled, the German positions fell silent except for the occasional thud of artillery fired more in frustration than in plan. They would have to wait for night to move again. Under cover of darkness they would reform and attack, because now pride demanded it. They had asked for surrender and received a word that mocked their confidence. They had seen their tanks burn in daylight and could not let the insult stand. Inside the basements and trenches, the Americans cleaned weapons and counted shells. They knew the night would bring a storm of steel. The question was not if the attack would come but where and when it would break upon them. The air turned brittle, and frost crept over gun barrels like a thin layer of glass. Somewhere beyond the lines engines rumbled to life, muffled and heavy. Somewhere else boots crunched over snow in formation. The defenders waited for the sound to grow closer. The next assault would come on Christmas morning, before dawn, when even the heart's rhythm slows and breath rises like smoke. But for now, in the brief pause before that reckoning, the town of Bastogne held its breath beneath a sky filled with ashes and light. Darkness returned with a kind of stillness that felt wrong. It was too calm, too wide, like the pause between heartbeats before something vital begins again. The snow had stopped, and the sky above Bastogne hung like black glass. Fires were hidden, smoke pressed low to the ground, and the only lights came from flashes far beyond the perimeter where German artillery tested their ranges. Men crouched in frozen foxholes, listening to the dull rhythm of distant engines. Somewhere out there, a new army was gathering in the dark. The day had brought them supplies and sunlight, but the night promised reckoning. McAuliffe's intelligence officers pieced together intercepted chatter and scattered prisoner statements. A fresh German formation had arrived, the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, veterans hardened by years of war. They were moving west to reinforce the failing ring, determined to break through the American defenses before dawn. The defenders could not afford illusions. The coming assault would be the largest yet, the kind that cracked lines and erased towns. In the shallow trenches around Champs, Hemrel, and the fields that folded toward the center of Bastogne, Men waited with fingers on triggers that stuck from the cold. Artillery crews stood by their guns, the barrels already blackened from days of constant firing. Each gun had a pile of shells stacked beside it, every casing glinting under a muted lantern. The men had learned to listen differently in these days, how to measure distance by echo, how to tell the size of a tank by the vibration underfoot. Every sound in the night was a question that might end in fire. At 3 in the morning on the 25th of December, the first answers came. The horizon to the west flared red as German guns opened. Seconds later the earth shook under the impact of their shells. The bombardment rolled over the town in waves, flattening snow into mist, tearing trees from the frozen ground. Then came the grinding of treads. Tanks moved forward through the haze, their silhouettes barely visible until they were within range of the outposts. Behind them marched infantry, thousands of them, spreading out into the fields. The first German units struck the lines of the 327th Glider Infantry. The defenders held their fire until the tanks were close enough for every shell to count. Then the world erupted. Anti-tank guns flashed, and tracers carved the night into ribbons of orange. Artillery, already pre-registered on those approaches, began to drop in calculated patterns. The fields became storms of fire and steel. German infantry tried to advance between the bursts, but every few meters the ground opened beneath them. The attack surged forward, faltered, and then pressed again. By 4 o'clock the fighting had reached the outskirts of Hemrel. Flames from burning tanks flickered across the snow, lighting the broken walls of barns and houses. American tank destroyers, hidden behind mounds of debris, fired into the flanks of advancing armor. The narrow lanes trapped the German vehicles, forcing them to turn one at a time into the arcs of waiting guns. When one tank burned, the next in line pushed forward through the wreckage, only to meet the same fate. The smoke grew thick enough to hide the stars. McAuliffe moved between his command post and the artillery positions, relaying coordinates and steadying his men. Reports came in from every sector, fragments of order inside chaos. Some outposts had been overrun, then retaken by counterattack. The line bent but did not break. Around 7 in the morning, the attackers began to lose momentum. German infantry caught between crossfires dropped into ditches that became their graves. Tanks that had penetrated the outer streets found themselves surrounded by fire from multiple directions. By mid-morning, the roar of battle faded to sporadic bursts of gunfire. Smoke hung over the fields like fog. The snow was no longer white. Where the German assault had begun, nothing moved except small columns of survivors dragging wounded men back toward their lines. In Hemrel, the wrecks of 18 tanks smoldered in the frozen mud. American losses were heavy, but the perimeter still held. The men who had fought through the night realized the date only when someone mentioned it softly. It was Christmas. For a few minutes the war seemed to loosen its grip. Soldiers opened the last of their rations, shared cigarettes, and wrote quick notes to families they hoped might read them someday. Some found pieces of the parachute silk that had delivered their supplies and wrapped it around their wrists for luck. The ground under them was torn and cold, but they were still there. The Germans had thrown everything they had and failed to break through. The ring had held again. But victory in a siege is not relief. The town still lay under the shadow of encirclement. Beyond the shattered roads, another army was fighting north through snow and fire to reach them. McAuliffe knew they were close. He could feel it in the intercepted radio bursts and in the growing pressure of German frustration. Somewhere to the south, engines of a different kind were moving, tanks carrying the star of the Third Army, carving their own road through the Ardennes. They were coming, but the defenders would have to survive one more day before they saw them. The sun rose pale and thin over Bastogne, casting long blue shadows across fields littered with the wreckage of Christmas Day. Smoke still drifted from the remains of burned tanks, curling like ghosts over the snow. The guns were quiet, though everyone knew the silence was temporary. Men moved stiffly among the ruins, faces hollow from exhaustion. The siege was not broken yet, but something in the air had changed. The German grip was tightening even as its strength began to fail. To the south, beyond the German ring, the engines of the 4th Armored Division were grinding forward through drifts of snow and shell craters. They were Patton's men, the tip of the spear sent to cut the noose. The roads they followed were little more than frozen scars, choked with wrecks and mines, each kilometer fought for by engineers and tank crews. For every village cleared, another ambush waited in the forest beyond. But the drive did not stop. Patton's orders were simple: reach Bastogne or die trying. Inside the surrounded town, McAuliffe tracked their progress through fragments of radio messages and distant gunfire that sometimes echoed through the hills. His men could hear it too, faint but distinct, like thunder from a faraway storm. It meant help was close. Yet hope in war is fragile. The Germans knew what was coming and shifted their own forces to block it. Every road leading south from Bastogne turned into a battlefield before dawn. On the 26th of December, the German command ordered another assault to finish the town before the American armor could reach it. The attack came not from the west this time, but from the southeast, aimed at the villages guarding the approach from Assinois. Columns of infantry and tanks rolled forward, their engines muffled by snow. The defenders had little left to give. Artillery ammunition was rationed again, fuel nearly gone. Still, the line held because there was nowhere else to go. Midday brought a faint vibration in the ground that did not belong to the enemy. It came from deeper south, a steady rhythm of tracks clanking over ice. Men at the southern edge of the perimeter lifted their heads, thinking at first it was another German attack. But the sound grew clearer, sharper, faster. Then, between the trees, a shape appeared, an American tank with its white star painted on the hull, followed by others. Behind them came engineers carrying the flag of the 326th Airborne Battalion. Lieutenant Charles Boggess, leading a platoon of Shermans from the 37th Tank Battalion, was the first to break through the German lines at Assinois. His tanks crushed the last roadblocks and burst into the open fields south of Bastogne. The snow churned under their treads as they drove toward the nearest American outpost. When the two columns met, the soldiers stared at each other for a moment, unsure if it was real. Then the radio crackled to life. The words were simple, carried with disbelief and relief. The road was open. McAuliffe reached the meeting point within the hour, trudging through snow and debris to greet the men who had fought their way through. The siege was broken. Supply trucks began to crawl forward behind the tanks, carrying ammunition, rations, and medical aid. The wounded were evacuated, the dead collected for burial. Yet no one in Bastogne celebrated. They were too cold, too hungry, too tired. They knew the battle was not finished. The Germans still held the high ground and the surrounding villages. The encirclement was cracked, not shattered. That night, the soldiers of the 101st Airborne slept for the first time in a week without fearing that the next shell might find them. Fires burned openly now, their lights spilling across the shattered streets. Snow continued to fall, covering the wreckage and the bodies with a thin white shroud. The sound of distant fighting still echoed across the hills, but for Bastogne, the storm had finally passed. What no one could see from the ground was the shape of defeat unfolding beyond their horizon. The German spearheads, starved of fuel and trapped in the maze of frozen roads, were already dying. Their advance had stalled so completely that the dream of reaching the Meuse was gone forever. What had begun as Hitler's last great gamble was ending in fire and silence. And in the heart of that ruin, a small town in Belgium stood as the stone that had broken the blade. The days that followed the relief of Bastogne did not bring rest, only a different kind of struggle. The snow kept falling, heavy and relentless, blanketing the wrecked fields until the contours of battle were buried. Men moved through it like ghosts, digging new positions, repairing guns, laying out the dead in rows that stretched behind barns and broken houses. Supply trucks ground through slush and ice, their engines coughing, headlights dimmed against the glare of snow. The siege had ended, but the battle still clawed at the edges of the town. Beyond the new line of defense, the German army was bleeding. What had once been a disciplined advance had turned into a desperate fight for survival. In the forest to the north and east, the 2nd Panzer Division sat crippled, its tanks without fuel, its men shivering in the open. Some units had gone 3 days without food. They scavenged through abandoned supply wagons and burned wrecks for warmth, waiting for orders that no longer made sense. The roads they had once owned now worked against them. Artillery and fighter bombers hunted them without pause, striking every column that dared to move in daylight. In the frozen villages west of Bastogne, the Panzerlehr Division fared no better. Of the 90 tanks that had crossed the German border, fewer than 20 could still move. The rest stood like iron skeletons in the snow, their crews long gone or buried inside. The men who survived dug shallow pits in the ice, knowing the ground itself was too hard for graves. The offensive that had promised a road to the Meuse had instead trapped them in the forests of Belgium, a graveyard made by their own ambition. Inside the American lines, the commanders were already thinking beyond the siege. Patton's forces were pressing north, linking with the battered airborne divisions to form a solid front. The Germans still held high ground in patches, but their ability to attack was gone. Every attempt to retake the initiative ended in fire from the sky. The clear weather that had saved Bastogne now punished everything in gray uniforms. Fighter bombers prowled the valleys, diving on convoys, strafing retreating troops, turning roads into rivers of twisted metal. McAuliffe moved among his men, his heavy coat stiff with frost. The newspapers back home were already calling him the hero of Bastogne, but he carried himself like a man who had simply done the work required. He looked at the faces of the survivors, tired, hollow-eyed, many wrapped in bandages, and knew that glory was a poor payment for what they had endured. They had not fought for fame or headlines. They had fought because the ground beneath their boots was the only thing left to hold. The German commanders were beginning to understand the scale of their failure. General von Luttwitz, who had ordered the surrender demand days earlier, watched his divisions fall apart piece by piece. The fuel that should have driven his tanks west now burned in the wrecks outside Bastogne. His infantry, meant to secure the supply routes, were being cut down by artillery they could no longer reach. He realized too late that surrounding Bastogne had been a fatal mistake. By fixing his best divisions around the town, he had frozen the entire offensive in place. On the map, it looked simple. Lines of blue advancing north, lines of red curling inward and breaking apart. But in the fields, it was chaos and exhaustion. Every tank destroyed left a crater filled with snow. Every forest clearing was marked by the black husks of trucks. The Ardennes, once a quiet region of farms and woods, had become a wasteland of steel and bone. By the 1st of January, 1945, the fighting around Bastogne had slowed to scattered exchanges. The Germans were retreating, leaving behind their wounded and their dead. The Americans advanced carefully, wary of mines and hidden guns, reclaiming ground that had cost them so much. The victory was not loud or triumphant. It was slow, grim, and heavy with the weight of what had been lost. The Battle of the Bulge, as it would come to be called, was ending. The last great gamble of the German army had spent itself in the snow. The spear that had driven into the Allied lines was shattered. In its place lay the wreckage of 5 divisions and the fading echo of a plan that had died in the white silence of the Ardennes. And in the center of it all, the town of Bastogne still stood, blackened by fire but unbroken, its streets marked by footprints that led not backward, but forward, into the rest of the war. January dragged on, gray and bitter, with the cold tightening its hold on the Ardennes like a clenched fist. The roads were lined with wreckage, the forests filled with the quiet wrecks of machines that would never move again. The great German gamble had failed, but the war was far from over. For the soldiers who had survived Bastogne, the days after victory felt almost unreal. The shooting had slowed, yet the land still trembled from distant artillery. No one trusted the silence. The 101st Airborne Division remained in place, rebuilding its lines and burying its dead. Engineers cleared mines from frozen roads while medics dug through rubble to reach cellars where the wounded still waited. The town smelled of smoke and diesel and thawing earth. Civilians who had hidden in basements began to emerge, pale and silent, their faces hollow from hunger. They wandered among the ruins, searching for homes that were no longer there. McAuliffe walked the perimeter each morning, his boots crunching on frost, his breath forming clouds in the air. He paused often at the artillery positions, now quiet except for the clank of men cleaning guns that had fired until their barrels glowed red. When he passed the makeshift graves, he saluted without words. The snow had covered the mounds in white, softening the shapes of the crosses. To him, the field looked peaceful, but it was the peace of exhaustion rather than triumph. Far to the east, the German army was collapsing. The remnants of the panzer divisions that had fought at Bastogne were streaming back toward the Rhine, pursued by Allied armor. Fuel shortages turned their retreat into a march on foot. The once proud columns of tanks were now twisted carcasses by the roadside, their crews trudging past them like shadows. Hitler's last offensive in the west had burned itself out, consuming what little strength his armies had left. When the weather finally began to break in February, the roads thawed into rivers of mud. Supply trucks bogged down, boots sank deep into the slush, and the air smelled of wet wood and cordite. But the men barely noticed. They were alive, and that was enough. Reinforcements arrived. Fresh troops from France, new tanks, and convoys of supplies. The front line pushed east again, slowly at first, then faster as the German resistance crumbled. In the months that followed, Bastogne became a rear area, a crossroads once more, this time for convoys moving toward Germany. The people rebuilt with whatever they could find: salvaged bricks, splintered beams, sheets of metal torn from wrecked trucks. The soldiers who had held the line moved on, leaving behind a town that would forever carry their story in its stones. McAuliffe, promoted and decorated, led his men through Germany until the war's final days. When spring finally came, the snow melted to reveal the scars of battle beneath, shell craters, trenches, and the dark outlines of tanks that had frozen into the earth. The fields that had been white with frost were now streaked with green again, the first signs of a world trying to heal. Bastogne stood at the center of it all, a monument without marble, a place where the tide of war had turned. For those who had fought there, it was more than a victory. It was proof that courage could outlast fear, that even surrounded and starving, men could hold the ground that mattered most. And so the long winter ended, not with parades or speeches, but with the slow return of color to a landscape that had been gray for too long. The crossroads was quiet again, but beneath the silence lay the echo of guns and the memory of a word that had defied an army. In the frozen forests east of Bastogne, the remnants of the German army stumbled back through the wreckage of their own ambition. Tanks stood silent by the roadside, engines seized, their blackened hulls half buried in snow. The men who had once marched with banners of confidence now moved in silence, their breath hanging like ghosts in the cold air. The Ardennes had become a graveyard, not just for soldiers, but for an entire plan, Hitler's last gamble, the great counterattack that was meant to split the Allies and reclaim the initiative in the West. At the top of that doomed plan stood General Otto von Manschufel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army. He was a professional soldier, sharp, experienced, and weary of politics, but he had followed orders because disobedience was no longer possible in Hitler's Germany. The plan had looked brilliant on paper. 3 armies would smash through the thinly held Ardennes, capture the port of Antwerp, and split the Allied front in two. Speed was everything. Surprise would do the rest. The terrain was difficult, but German armor had done the impossible before. What no general could plan for was the stubbornness of one small town. Manschufel had expected to bypass Bastogne, not to be trapped fighting for it. His orders to bypass resistance were sound in theory, but by the time his subordinate, General Heinrich von Luttwitz, reached the outskirts of Bastogne, the situation had changed. American airborne troops had arrived overnight. The town was no longer a soft target, it was a fortress in the making. Von Luttwitz hesitated, unsure whether to press on or to crush the pocket before it became a threat. In war, hesitation is a luxury no one can afford. When von Luttwitz chose to surround Bastogne instead of bypassing it, the shape of the offensive changed forever. His corps became fixed, its strength drawn into a siege that should never have existed. Every tank and gun he used against the town was one less moving toward the Meuse. Manschufel knew it was a mistake, but by the time he realized it, it was already too late to reverse. The terrain, the weather, and the speed of the Allied response had turned his offensive into a slow collapse. For the German High Command, the problem was more than tactical. It was psychological. Hitler's faith in victory had blinded him to the limits of his army. Supplies were gone. Fuel stocks were almost empty. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was a shadow of itself. The Ardennes offensive had consumed the last reserves of men and machines that Germany could field in the west. When those divisions died in the snow around Bastogne, there would be no replacements. Von Lüttwitz, once proud of his reputation as a disciplined and aggressive commander, spent his final days of the battle sending desperate reports to headquarters. His messages grew shorter, colder. Ammunition low. Units scattered. Roads blocked. Every attempt to regain momentum collapsed under American artillery and air attacks. When the skies cleared, Allied aircraft turned the roads into a slaughter. The supply columns he needed burned under the open sky. His divisions were being crushed not by superior numbers, but by a trap he had built with his own orders. By the first days of January, the generals could no longer deny the truth. The spearhead divisions that had been meant to reach the Meuse were gone. Destroyed, encircled, or out of fuel. The Panzer Lehr division, the elite of the elite, had been reduced to a handful of tanks. The 2nd Panzer Division, once the pride of Germany's armor, was shattered beyond repair. The Volksgrenadier divisions that had followed them were little more than bands of survivors. The dream of cutting the Allied front in two had dissolved into retreat. In the final reports written after the battle, both Manschufel and von Lüttwitz admitted the same thing. The decision to surround Bastogne had doomed the entire operation. What they believed was a tactical opportunity had become a strategic disaster. The town they thought they were besieging had, in truth, besieged them. Their armored divisions had not trapped the Americans, they had trapped themselves. And as the surviving generals withdrew across the snow, the once proud columns of the panzer armies faded into history, leaving only burned wrecks and frozen footprints to mark where they had stood. The gamble was over. The price had been paid. The war in the West would never again belong to Germany. When the smoke finally lifted over the Ardennes, the landscape revealed its scars. Burned trees stood like black spears against the pale snow, and every road was lined with the skeletons of trucks and tanks. The crossroads of Bastogne had become more than a point on a map. It was the fulcrum upon which an entire offensive had turned and broken. In military schools years later, officers would study it and call it a masterpiece of defense, an unplanned, improvised stand that rewrote the rules of modern warfare. The lessons were plain, carved into the frozen earth. Control the terrain, and you control the battle. Bastogne had not been chosen for beauty or comfort. It was chosen because 7 roads met there, because whoever held it could shape the flow of men and supplies through the entire region. The German army, once unmatched in its maneuver warfare, had learned too late that mobility means nothing without fuel and open roads. The Americans, under McAuliffe's reluctant command, had understood this instinctively. They did not need to move fast, they only needed to make the enemy slow down. After the siege ended, Allied commanders studied how the defense had worked. It was not luck. It was discipline, preparation, and the seamless connection between artillery, infantry, and air support. Every gun crew had known their targets before the first shot was fired. Every paratrooper understood that the roads were worth more than the fields around them. When the German armor rolled forward, they met a wall of pre-sighted fire so precise that whole attacks vanished in minutes. It was a lesson in the economy of strength, how a smaller, colder, hungrier force could defeat a larger one by choosing the ground and forcing the enemy to fight on its terms. For the Americans, Bastogne became a model for the defensive doctrine that would guide them for decades. In the years of the Cold War, military planners studying maps of Europe would trace lines along highways and rivers, remembering how a handful of soldiers had fixed entire divisions in place by holding one vital junction. They called it positional dominance, but the soldiers who lived it had a simpler name for it: survival. As the snow melted in early spring, reporters and photographers arrived to record what was left. They found a town reduced to rubble, its church steeples shattered, its streets buried in mud. Yet among the ruins, the spirit of victory lingered. The people of Bastogne rebuilt slowly, brick by brick, while the soldiers who had defended them moved eastward with the advancing front. Their footprints and tire tracks faded, but their presence remained in the stories told by those who had watched the battle unfold from cellar windows. Engineers collected the twisted remains of German tanks and stacked them at the roadside like trophies. Children played on them, unaware that they were climbing over history. The crossroads that had once been a target became a symbol, a place where the tide of the war had turned not by overwhelming power, but by stubborn endurance. Military historians counted the cost: over 20,000 German casualties, 5 divisions shattered, and hundreds of tanks lost. For the Americans, about 2,500 men killed, wounded, or missing. The numbers alone could not tell the story. The true weight of Bastogne lay in what it had prevented. The German advance toward Antwerp had stopped. The hope of dividing the Allied front had died. The war in Western Europe had reached a point from which it could only move in one direction, toward Germany and toward the end. In the months that followed, the snow melted into rivers that carried the stains of battle away. New green grass grew over the shell craters. The roads were repaired and filled again with convoys, this time heading east. The Iron Crossroads had done its work. It had stopped an empire, and it had reminded the world that sometimes the hardest battles are not won by attacking, but by refusing to move. News of Bastogne spread faster than the thaw. Before the last fires had burned out, correspondents were already sending stories back across the channel, and from there across the ocean. The word that McAuliffe had written as a joke of defiance, just one sharp syllable, became headline and myth. Nuts, they printed in bold type, a single word that carried the sound of an entire army refusing to surrender. In cafes from London to New York, people read about the stand at Bastogne and imagined men frozen to the bone, holding the crossroads against impossible odds. They saw it as the symbol of how the Allies fought the war itself, not with grand speeches, but with stubborn courage in small places that changed the shape of the world. The newspapers called McAuliffe the man who said no to Hitler, and the legend began to grow. Back in Europe, the soldiers who had lived through the siege found the fame strange. To them, the word had been just a burst of laughter in a basement full of exhaustion. But as letters and photographs arrived from home, they began to understand that something larger had taken root. Children in America sent them drawings. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh named tanks and trucks after Bastogne. Even among the Allies, the town became shorthand for grit. Whenever a position was hopeless, commanders would say, "Hold like Bastogne." The legend took on its own life. Within weeks, the phrase, "nuts to them," appeared on posters, painted on bombers, and scribbled on the sides of helmets. It was the kind of symbol a weary world needed, simple, human, and unbreakable. The word made people smile because it was so ordinary, so American, so far from the solemn language of war. It reminded them that sometimes courage sounded like sarcasm shouted into the face of death. For McAuliffe, the attention was unexpected. He accepted his medal with quiet pride, but whenever reporters asked him what he had really meant, he gave the same answer: it was just what came to mind. He credited his men, the gunners and engineers and medics who had made the defense possible. Yet the world wanted heroes, and he became one, whether he liked it or not. The people of Bastogne rebuilt their town around the memory of that winter. They raised monuments where the tanks had burned, planted trees where the trenches had been, and placed plaques along the roads that once carried death. Every December, they held parades in the snow, honoring the soldiers who had fought for them. Veterans returned, older and slower, their uniforms tight at the collar, standing beside the children of the town they had saved. In time, the myth and the memory became one. Bastogne was no longer just a battle. It was a story told at dinner tables, a name carved into stone, a word passed down through generations. Nuts was no longer defiance in a basement. It was endurance turned into legend. And though the snow melted and the years drifted on, the crossroads still stood, silent, cold, and unyielding, like the men who had refused to leave it. Spring came late to Belgium in 1945. The thaw turned trenches into rivers, washed the soot from the roofs, and uncovered the iron bones of the battlefield. The roads that had once been broken by tanks now carried convoys of victory. American columns rolled east, past the signposts that still bore the scars of shrapnel, past the forests where whole divisions had disappeared into snow. The war was moving away, but Bastogne stayed behind as a quiet marker of where the tide had turned. General Anthony McAuliffe left the town as he had found it, in cold weather and under heavy clouds. He was now a major general, carrying a medal on his chest and the weight of a memory he would never escape. He visited the graves before departing, the neat rows stretching across the hillside. The crosses gleamed white against the soil that had once been frozen hard. He spoke softly to no one in particular, then turned toward his jeep and drove away through the crossroads he had defended. The wind behind him carried the faint sound of church bells from the town below. The 101st Airborne Division marched on, thin from hunger but proud. They crossed rivers, liberated towns, and followed the front to the Rhine. When Germany finally collapsed, they were among the first to see the ruins of the empire that had once seemed unstoppable. The soldiers who had survived Bastogne looked at the wreckage of cities and felt no joy, only the quiet knowledge that the cost had been worth it. They had seen what happened when a line held, and they had seen what happened when it broke. Across the ruins, the German generals faced their reckoning. Von Luttwitz surrendered his remaining forces, his once proud corps reduced to fragments. Von Manschufel was captured soon after. In captivity, he spoke often about Bastogne, calling it the point where the war in the West was lost. He admitted that he had underestimated both the Americans and the terrain, but most of all, he had underestimated time. Every day spent around Bastogne had drained the last fuel from his divisions and the last hope from his army. When the shooting finally stopped, the world began to measure what had been spent. The German army had lost 5 armored divisions around Bastogne, divisions that could have defended the Rhine, perhaps even slowed the Allied advance into Germany. Instead, they were gone, buried under snow and history. The Allies had lost thousands too, but they had gained something that cannot be counted. They had gained momentum, belief, and the certainty that the war could and would be won. In the years after, McAuliffe continued to serve. He led new divisions, commanded in Europe, and later returned home to a quieter life. But wherever he went, the shadow of Bastogne followed. People called him the hero of the Ardennes. To him, the real heroes were the men who never left the town. He often said the same words when asked about that winter: "We didn't need rescuing. We had them right where we wanted them." He said it with a smile, but behind the humor lay the truth. He had understood the trap long before anyone else. Bastogne rebuilt itself stone by stone. Children played in the fields where tanks once burned. Farmers plowed over the craters, and new houses rose on ground that had been soaked with fire. In the town square, a monument of marble and steel bore the names of the divisions that had fought there. Visitors came from all over the world to stand at the crossroads and look out over the rolling hills. The wind still carried the same chill, and sometimes, in winter, the snow fell in the same way it had during those terrible days. As the decades passed, the veterans grew old. Their stories became history lessons, then films, then legends. But the truth of Bastogne never faded. It remained a story about courage in the face of despair, about a frozen town that refused to fall, and about a single word that summed up an army's refusal to yield. The war ended, the soldiers went home, and the snow returned every year to cover the fields. But beneath that white silence lay the memory of the men who had stood together at the edge of defeat and found victory instead. The road beyond the snow led eastward, toward peace, toward the future. Yet for those who had walked it, Bastogne would always be the place where winter itself had been conquered, not by warmth, but by will.